The galaxy was ancient, filled with civilizations that had risen and fallen like waves on a distant shore. But in this vast cosmic dance, power dictated who thrived and who perished. Those with vast armadas and economic might carved their empires into the fabric of the stars, while weaker species, those without war fleets, without political leverage, were often left to fade into obscurity. Their cries for help were drowned out by the endless pursuit of progress, expansion, and dominance. Among the Forsaken were the Valarans, a species once revered for their artistry, philosophy, and profound spiritual wisdom. For thousands of years, they had lived in peace, their homeworld, Valara Prime, a jewel of culture and tranquility. Unlike the warlike races that sought dominion over the stars, the Valarans had pursued enlightenment, dedicating themselves to the pursuit of knowledge and the refinement of their intricate, almost mystical craftsmanship. Their cities were marvels of architecture, blending seamlessly with the lush landscapes of their world, their towering spires covered in delicate carvings that told stories of their history, their dreams, and their connection to the cosmos. But peace and beauty had no place in a galaxy ruled by strength. The fall of Valara Prime centuries ago, the Torvok Dominion, a brutal, expansionist empire, set its eyes on Valara Prime. The Torvok were warlords, their civilization built upon conquest and subjugation. To them, the Valarans were not a people worthy of respect, but a resource to be exploited. The delicate artifacts they crafted, commodities to be plundered. Their vast libraries of knowledge, intellectual trophies to be claimed. Their people, weaklings, fit only for enslavement. The invasion was swift and merciless. The Valarans had no standing military. Their leaders had long believed that diplomacy and trade were enough to ensure peace, that wisdom would triumph over brutality. But wisdom could not stop the Torvok war machine. The first orbital bombardments reduced entire cities to rubble in mere hours. Firestorms raged across the planet's surface, consuming temples that had stood for millennia. The Valarans, desperate and terrified, sent urgent distress signals across the stars, pleading for help from the Galactic Council, the ruling body of the galaxy's major powers. But their cries fell on deaf ears. The Council, a collection of bureaucrats and powerful species, weighed the situation carefully. Valara Prime held no strategic value, no powerful alliances, no vast deposits of rare minerals or energy sources. Intervening would risk war with the Torvok Dominion, a war that the Council had no interest in fighting, and so they did nothing. For the Valarans, there was no rescue, no last-minute salvation. The Torvok descended upon the planet like a plague. Those who resisted were executed in public squares as warnings. The rest were shackled, forced into labor, camps to mine the very resources stolen from their own world. Over decades, the Valaran civilization withered. Their culture was systematically erased, their history rewritten to serve as nothing more than a footnote in the Dominion's archives. When the conquest was complete, the Torvok departed, leaving only a skeletal remnant of the people they had destroyed. The Valarans became ghosts in their own world. Their once grand cities reduced to hollow ruins, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. And so, the galaxy forgot them. The arrival of humanity centuries later, when the human exploration vessel, UES Horizon, entered the uncharted region of space where Valara Prime lay. Its crew had no idea they were about to uncover a forgotten tragedy. Humanity was still a relatively young presence in the galactic community. While they had proven themselves adaptable, resourceful, and ambitious, they had yet to gain the influence of the older, more established empires. Many saw them as upstarts, HFY species that had expanded rapidly, but lacked the wisdom of the ancients. Captain Elias Carter, a seasoned officer of the United Earth Navy, had led numerous exploration missions before. He had seen the ruins of ancient civilizations, had walked among the remnants of species long extinct. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found on Valara Prime. As the horizon descended into the planet's atmosphere, Carter and his crew were met with a haunting sight. The land was scarred, the air heavy with the weight of centuries-old devastation. What had once been a thriving world was now a graveyard, where the remains of a forgotten people struggled to survive. The Valarans who remained were barely recognizable as the once proud species recorded in ancient archives. Their bodies were frail, their clothing tattered. Starvation had hollowed their features, and their eyes, once filled with the wisdom of a civilization that had known only peace, now held only exhaustion and despair. When Carter and his team stepped onto the planet's surface, they were met with suspicion. The Valarans had been betrayed before, abandoned by those who had promised to protect them. To them, the arrival of new visitors could mean only one thing: more suffering. But as the humans began distributing food, setting up medical stations, and repairing water purifiers, something unexpected happened. Hope, long buried under centuries of pain, flickered back to life. The choice that would change everything. News of Valara Prime's plight spread quickly within the United Earth Federation. The images captured by the Horizon's crew ignited a firestorm of debate among humanity's leaders. There were those who argued that humanity had no place in this conflict, that interfering in the affairs of a long-forgotten species could bring unwanted consequences. The Torvok Dominion was powerful, far larger and more militarized than Earth's growing fleet. Opposing them could mean war, and war was a risk humanity could not afford. But there were others, military leaders, politicians, civilians, who saw something deeper in this moment. This was not just about a single species. This was about the kind of civilization humanity would choose to be in the stars. Would they be like the Council, standing by as atrocities unfolded? Or would they take a stand, even when the odds were against them? The debate raged for weeks, but in the end, the decision was made. Humanity would not turn its back on the forgotten ones. Within days, convoys of aid ships were dispatched to Valara Prime, loaded with food, medicine, and technology to help rebuild what had been lost. Engineers and medical teams arrived in force, setting up infrastructure, constructing homes, and restoring power grids long thought dead. The Valarans, who had expected only more suffering, now saw something they had never witnessed before: a species willing to fight for them, not against them. The first threat, but as humanity worked tirelessly to restore Valara Prime, the galaxy finally took notice. The Torvok Dominion sent a warning, a simple transmission: withdraw from Valara Prime immediately. This world is under our control. Leave or face the consequences. The Galactic Council, silent as ever, watched from the sidelines. They had abandoned the Valarans once. Now they would not lift a finger, as another war threatened to begin. Elias Carter, standing amid the ruins of Valara Prime, looked up at the darkening sky. He knew what this meant. The galaxy had ignored the Valarans for centuries, but now humanity had made a choice, and war was coming. The warning came in the dead of night, a pulse of encoded data transmitted across the cold void of space. It was not a negotiation, nor a request. It was a command. The Torvok Dominion did not waste words with diplomacy when dealing with lesser beings. Their message was clear: withdraw from Valara Prime, or be annihilated. Captain Elias Carter stood on the command deck of the UES Horizon, the glow of the transmission flickering across his hardened features. He had spent decades navigating the political minefields of interstellar diplomacy, but this was different. The Torvok were not a power one ignored lightly. Their fleets were massive, their war doctrines merciless. They did not recognize the concept of mercy, nor did they tolerate defiance. Behind him, his bridge officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen the Valarans, the skeletal remains of a civilization betrayed and abandoned, and they knew what leaving meant. If humanity turned its back now, the Torvok would not simply reclaim their property. They would purge the world of every last survivor, erasing all traces of the Valarans' existence. Silence filled the bridge as the crew awaited Carter's response. The weight of an entire species' fate pressed down on him. He exhaled sharply, his voice firm, transmit a reply. 4 words: we are not leaving. The room tensed. There was no going back now. Within hours, the skies above Valara Prime grew hostile. Torvok scout ships appeared at the system's outer edge, watching, assessing, reporting. The Dominion had expected a swift retreat, a show of submission. Instead, they found an obstacle they had never encountered before: a species that refused to bow. The Torvok warlord in charge of the sector, High Commander Vortak, did not react with anger. Anger was for lesser beings. Instead, he found himself intrigued. Humanity was new to the stars, an upstart race barely a few centuries into space. Travel. Yet here they were, standing their ground against an empire that had crushed civilizations far older and more powerful. Foolish, but interesting. As the first human aid ships continued to arrive, converting ruined cityscapes into shelters, the Torvok watched. They studied the humans' tactics, their methods, their weaknesses. This was no longer a simple matter of reclaiming an abandoned world. It was now a test of what kind of species humanity truly was. Meanwhile, the Galactic Council remained silent. They had abandoned Valara Prime once. Now, they merely observed from their ivory towers, unwilling to challenge the balance of power. To interfere would risk war with the Dominion, and no one was willing to burn their hands for the sake of a forgotten world. But humanity did not seek permission. As the days stretched into weeks, something remarkable happened. The Valarans, long convinced that no one would ever fight for them, began to rise from the ashes. Those who had spent centuries in the shadows, hiding from the ghosts of their past, now stepped forward. They watched the humans rebuild their broken cities, mend their wounds, teach their children. They listened to Carter's officers speak of resistance, of defiance, of standing up to those who would see them erased. For the first time in generations, they felt something they had forgotten the taste of. Hope. Yet hope was a fragile thing, and the Torvok were about to shatter it. The first strike came without warning. A single Torvok dreadnought emerged from the void, a dark monolith of destruction. It did not announce its arrival. It did not send a demand. It simply opened fire. The orbital defense grid, hastily cobbled together from repurposed satellites and outdated shielding systems, barely held. Explosions ripped through the night sky, casting fiery reflections across the surface of the world. Valaran refugees clutched each other in terror as plasma bolts rained down, tearing through the outskirts of their new settlements. But this was no mindless bombardment. It was a test. The Torvok wanted to see how the humans would react. Would they run, as so many before them had? Would they surrender, grovel for mercy that would never come? Elias Carter gave them an answer. The Horizon's guns roared to life, unleashing streams of accelerated tungsten rounds that tore into the dreadnought's shields. It was a lopsided battle. A single human warship against a vessel designed to conquer entire star systems. But the humans fought with a ferocity the Torvok had not anticipated. They did not fight to win. They fought to protect, and that made them dangerous. As the battle raged, something changed in the Valarans. The survivors, once a broken people, resigned to their fate, began to fight alongside their newfound allies. Engineers, once forced to dismantle their own technology for the Torvok, began restoring ancient Valaran defenses buried beneath the ruins. Scholars, once silenced by centuries of oppression, uncovered forgotten weapons of their ancestors, artifacts of a time before they had forsaken war. The Valarans were not warriors, but they had not always been weak. And now, with the humans at their side, they would no longer be victims. Yet as the dreadnought retreated, vanishing back into the abyss of space, a single transmission echoed across the comms. A voice, cold and amused. "You've made a mistake, humans. You should have left when you had the chance." In the darkness beyond Valara Prime, an armada was gathering. The real war was about to begin. The eerie calm that followed the Torvok dreadnought's retreat was more unsettling than the battle itself. On the surface of Valara Prime, survivors cautiously emerged from shelters, gazing at the smoke-choked sky where the scars of orbital bombardment still burned like open wounds. The humans had won this fight, but everyone knew it had been nothing more than a trial, a prelude to the true storm that was coming. Inside the UES Horizon, Captain Elias Carter stood before the central war table, surrounded by his senior officers and Valaran representatives. A holographic projection displayed the latest intelligence scans, an expanding ripple in the void, a disturbance in the local space-time fabric. It was unmistakable. The Torvok armada was coming. "They're not taking us seriously," Commander Helena Vasquez muttered, arms crossed as she studied the enemy's movements. That dreadnought was just a probe. They wanted to see how we'd react. They saw, Carter said. His voice was calm, but his expression was grave. And now they'll come back with enough firepower to erase this world from existence. Across the table, Valaran Elder Selen Vey let out a slow breath. His species had suffered for generations, scattered, beaten, silenced. But the sight of humans standing before him, speaking of resistance, stirred something deep within him. He was old enough to remember what it was like before the Torvok came, before the Council abandoned them. He had lived long enough to see hope fade. But now, for the first time in centuries, it had returned. "I do not understand you humans," Selen admitted. "Your species is new to the stars. You do not have the numbers or the fleets to match the Dominion. And yet, you choose to fight." His golden eyes searched Carter's face. "Why?" The question lingered in the air. Elias Carter did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the faces around him, his crew, hardened men and women who had served in countless battles, and the Valarans, who had spent lifetimes waiting for a savior that had never come. "We weren't supposed to be here," Carter finally said. "Every logical option says we should have left, that we should have let this world fall." He met Selen's gaze. "But we don't abandon people. Not when we can fight." The words settled deep within the Valaran Elder's soul. He had spent too many years believing that all civilizations were the same, that all species, when faced with annihilation, would choose the easy path, the one of least resistance. But the humans had made their choice. They would fight, and the Valarans would stand with them. The next hours were a whirlwind of activity. The humans began shoring up defenses, integrating whatever Valaran technology could still be salvaged. Generations of decay had left much of their infrastructure in ruins, but deep beneath the capital city, they uncovered something remarkable: an ancient power grid, still operational after all these years. Buried within the subterranean chambers, human engineers reactivated massive energy conduits, their glow illuminating forgotten halls. Valaran scientists, once scholars of lost knowledge, began decoding old tactical archives, unearthing forgotten battle doctrines from an era before their species had been pacified. What had once been a dying world was beginning to awaken. Yet time was against them. The Torvok were fast, too fast. The first sensor alarms erupted like klaxons, a gravitational disturbance at the edge of the system. Then another, and another. Elias Carter and his officers rushed to the bridge, just in time to watch reality itself rip apart. Dozens of Torvok warships emerged from hyperspace. Sleek, angular destroyers, built for planetary suppression. Their black hulls reflected nothing, as if they drank in the light itself. Then came the battlecruisers, vast, city-sized vessels, armed with enough firepower to raise continents. They slid into formation like hunting beasts, their weapons glowing, with the promise of destruction. The Torvok had not come to fight a battle. They had come to make an example. On the bridge of the horizon, the crew worked in grim silence, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. "We're outnumbered," Vasquez murmured. Carter gave a sharp nod. "That was always going to be the case." He turned to the Valaran elder beside him. "Selen, if you and your people want to run, we won't stop you. We'll hold them off as long as we can." But Selen Vey did not waver. His voice was steady. "There is nowhere left to run." The old Valaran stepped forward, gazing at the enemy fleet as if staring into the past. "For centuries, we were told to bow, to submit, to accept that the universe had no place for us. But now we choose to stand." The Valarans had long believed themselves a dead race, but they were not dead. Not anymore. The first Torvok bombardment struck like the hammer of a vengeful god, and the war for Valara Prime had begun. The first wave came without mercy. From orbit, the Torvok fleet rained devastation upon Valara Prime. Columns of light lanced down from the sky, each one a weaponized beam of antimatter that carved through ancient stone and modern alloy alike. Firestorms erupted across the capital, consuming what little remained of the once grand civilization. Structures that had withstood centuries of decay crumbled in an instant. It was not an invasion. It was extermination. The Valarans had seen this before. They had lived through it. But this time, they did not kneel. From hidden bunkers beneath the ruins, Valaran pulse cannons roared to life. Old weapons, long thought, useless, belched ribbons of burning plasma into the sky. The first few shots missed, their targeting systems struggling to lock onto the fast-moving enemy ships. But then the human engineers intervened. Adaptive fire control algorithms, quickly uploaded from the Horizon's databanks, took over, recalibrating Velaran defenses with brutal precision. The next volley found its mark. A Torvok destroyer lurched. As its shields flickered, the impact sending arcs of destabilized energy rippling across its obsidian hull. Then another. And another. Valaran gunners adjusted their aim, guided by the cold efficiency of human software, and for the first time, in centuries, their weapons struck true. In orbit, the Horizon moved like a vengeful ghost, slipping between the Torvok battle lines with impossible agility. It was a single warship against an armada, but it did not fight like prey. Its railguns thundered, sending hyper-accelerated tungsten slugs straight through enemy hulls. Torvok's shielding technology was advanced, but it had never been designed to withstand sheer kinetic brutality. One enemy cruiser detonated from within, its core rupturing under the force of a direct impact. Another had its engines sheared clean, off, sending it spiraling toward the planet below. But the Torvok adapted. They always did. The next wave of their ships shifted their formation, executing a maneuver so precise it bordered on mathematical perfection. Their weapons recalibrated, adjusting to counter the unpredictability of human tactics. And then the real slaughter began. A barrage of gravitic warheads slammed into Valara's surface. The bombs didn't explode in the traditional sense. Instead, they ripped gravity apart, creating microsingularities that pulled entire city blocks into themselves before collapsing. Whole districts of the capital vanished in an instant, replaced by deep, gaping voids. The Valaran resistance was holding the line, but it was a line drawn in sand before a tidal wave. Inside the Horizon, Carter and his officers fought to keep pace with the chaos unfolding. Vasquez was barking orders, her hands moving across her console in rapid succession as she rerouted power to failing systems. Casualty reports flooded in from the surface. The Valarans were dying by the thousands. The planetary defense network was holding, for now. But the Torvok had enough ships to grind them down indefinitely. They needed an edge, and that was when the Valaran elder, Seelan Vey, stepped forward. "There is something," he said, his voice slow, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Something we swore to never awaken." Carter turned to him, his expression hard. "Now is not the time for riddles, Seelan." The old Valaran hesitated, as if afraid of the words he was about to speak. "Beneath our capital," he said. "Buried, deep beneath the old cities is a weapon from the First War, a relic from a time when my people still fought." He looked at Carter with haunted eyes. "We abandoned it. We let it sleep, because we feared what it would make us become." Carter's breath hitched. "What kind of weapon?" Seelan closed his eyes for a long moment. One that even the Torvok feared. For a heartbeat no one spoke. Then Carter nodded. "Show me." The descent into the depths of Valara was not easy. The underground tunnels were ancient, some barely holding together, others littered with the remains of those who had died long ago. Human engineers and Velaran survivors moved as one, carrying equipment, powering up old systems. The deeper they went, the colder it became, not physically, but something else. Something in the air. At last, they arrived. A vast chamber stretched out before them, its ceiling lost in shadow. Massive structures of blackened metal loomed in the darkness, their shapes vaguely recognizable, like war machines frozen in time. And at the heart of it all, a singular, towering construct. It was old, unimaginably old. Etched into its surface were markings that predated the Velaran written language. Sigils from a time when war was not just fought, but worshipped. As the lights flickered on, the truth became undeniable. This was not just a weapon. This was a god of war, built from the bones of an empire that had refused to die. And now, after centuries of silence, it was about to wake up. A deep hum resonated through the chamber, low and primal, vibrating through the ancient walls, Dust trickled from unseen crevices as the forgotten war machine stirred for the first time in centuries. Valaran engineers, their hands trembling, moved hesitantly around the titanic structure, activating long dormant systems with human assistance. Every switch flipped, every power conduit restored. Felt like feeding a sleeping beast. Carter stood at the edge of the control platform, staring up at the towering construct. It was not just a weapon. It was something older. Something that had been built at the height of Valaran ambition, when their kind still saw themselves as warriors. But it had been left to rot. The echoes of their ancestors' fear lingered in the metal, in the very silence that had kept it buried. "Are you sure about this?" Vasquez's voice was quiet, but edged with tension. Selenve, standing beside her, clenched his jaw. "I do not know. But I do know that if we do nothing, my people will cease to exist. And if that happens, what was the point of our restraint?" The words hung in the air for a moment before Carter gave the only answer that mattered. "Power it up." The chamber shuddered. The Valaran engineers input the necessary sequences. The humans provided raw energy conduits, channeling Horizon's reserves into the ancient circuits. What should have taken months was done in minutes, human efficiency, and Valaran knowledge fusing into something neither species could have accomplished alone. And then, the machine opened its eyes. They were not eyes in the conventional sense, but something deeper, more instinctual. Vast arrays of targeting sensors and threat analysis grids surged to life, scanning the world beyond. A metallic groan filled the cavern as the construct's limbs shifted, servos grinding against time itself as movement returned to the dormant titan. The energy signature alone was enough to send ripples through the battlefield above. The Torvok noticed immediately. A surge of data flooded the Valaran consoles. A name, buried in forgotten archives, surfaced on the main display. Sentinel Prime 03. Carter exhaled sharply. "What is it armed with?" One of the engineers, a young Valaran whose ancestors had only spoken of war as myth, swallowed hard before answering. "Everything." Above them, the battle was reaching a breaking point. The Valaran defense lines were crumbling under the relentless Torvok assault. Every gun emplacement lost meant thousands more dead. The Horizon was still holding its own, but it was running out of time. One ship could not hold off an entire fleet forever. The Torvok commanders, sensing victory, began the final push. Their warships descended en masse, no longer content to bombard from orbit. They wanted the kill, and that was when the ground beneath them split apart. A shockwave of unimaginable force tore through the capital as Sentinel Prime 03 emerged. The machine did not rise. It erupted, tearing through bedrock, smashing through the ruins that had hidden it for generations. A living monolith of war, its blackened hull bristling with weaponry no one had seen in eons, energy cores humming, with the rage of a fallen empire. The Torvok hesitated. For the first time since the battle had begun, they hesitated. And then, Sentinel Prime fired. A single beam of searing golden light cut through the sky like the judgment of a forgotten god. The Torvok warships in its path never stood a chance. Their shields were meaningless before the sheer magnitude of destruction the machine could unleash. The first vessel in its sights vanished in an instant, reduced to nothing but scattered particles in the wind. The second had just enough time to attempt an evasive maneuver before the energy beam pierced straight through its hull, detonating its reactor in a cataclysmic fireball. The machine did not stop. Its artillery banks, ancient but deadly, swiveled skyward, unleashing a barrage of hyperkinetic slugs and plasma lances that tore into the enemy fleet. Torvok formations crumbled as ship after ship was annihilated, their sleek, precise movements no match for the sheer brute force of a war machine designed to eradicate civilizations. And yet, the Torvok still fought. They adapted, their ships scattered, reconfiguring into evasive formations. Their capital vessels unleashed gravitational distortions, attempting to disrupt Sentinel Prime's targeting arrays. It almost worked. But the machine was learning, as if remembering the wars it had once fought. It adjusted its targeting systems in real time, recalibrating at speeds beyond comprehension. The Valaran engineers barely understood what they had activated, but they could feel it. A presence, an intelligence built for one thing alone: War Carter's voice came through the comms, cold and unwavering. Push forward. We're not just surviving this. We're winning. Vasquez relayed the orders to the fleet. The Valaran forces, once desperate and on the verge of collapse, saw their ancient guardian tear through the enemy like a force of nature. And, for the first time in generations, they felt hope. The horizon took advantage of the chaos, weaving through shattered enemy formations, picking off crippled warships with ruthless efficiency. The remaining planetary defenses, inspired by the Titan now standing among them, fired with renewed vigor. The Torvok, for all their power, had made a grave miscalculation. They had assumed Valara was defenseless. They had assumed humanity would not interfere. They had assumed the past was dead, but the past had just awakened, and now it was coming for them. The battlefield was no longer just a fight for survival. It had become something greater, something primal. A reckoning was unfolding over Valara, as history's forgotten war machine ripped through the invaders with the raw fury of an empire long buried in dust. Sentinel Prime 03 moved with terrifying precision, its vast metal limbs shifting effortlessly, despite their monumental weight. Its ancient targeting systems had not dulled with time. Instead, they seemed to have adapted. It analyzed, predicted, and struck before the enemy even knew what was happening. Every shot, every beam of pure annihilation was calculated, delivering destruction with surgical efficiency. Torvok warships, once the embodiment of fear, were now prey. Their sleek, predator-like hulls twisted and dove, attempting to evade the relentless assault. But the Sentinel was no mere brute force construct. It was a master of war, built in an age when the Valarans still dared to call themselves conquerors. Its weapon systems didn't just fire, they thought. Adaptive plasma arrays locked onto Torvok ships, adjusting mid-fire to counter their erratic movements. Their vaunted gravitational distortions, normally a death sentence for any fleet foolish enough to resist, were now useless against the machine's evolving targeting matrix. A battlecruiser attempted a high-speed retreat, engaging its dimensional slipstream drive to escape orbit. The moment it reached critical velocity, Sentinel Prime fired. A pulse of gravitic shear energy surged through space, collapsing the ship's warp tunnel before it could form. The cruiser ripped itself apart, its own escape attempt turned into a self-inflicted execution. Carter watched from the horizon's command deck, hands gripping the railing as the once invincible enemy fell apart before their eyes. "Unbelievable," Vasquez whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and battle-hardened focus. "We might actually pull this off." But the Torvok were not broken yet. They were vicious, unforgiving hunters, and like any predator backed into a corner, they lashed out. Their fleet, though battered, regrouped with terrifying efficiency. Their commanders, now recognizing the Sentinel as the single greatest threat on the field, adapted their strategy. No longer spreading out to engage the entire planet, they converged, focusing their remaining firepower on one singular goal: the destruction of Sentinel Prime. Within moments, dozens of ships coordinated their attacks, unleashing concentrated salvos of neutron lances, quantum torpedoes, and exotic matter disruptors. It was an assault designed to erase entire worlds, and it was all aimed at the ancient war machine. The first barrage struck with cataclysmic force. Valara's atmosphere ignited, entire sections of the battlefield reduced to molten slag as hyper-accelerated. Projectiles punched through the air like celestial spears. Firestorms erupted across the ruined cityscape, the sheer concussive force sending shockwaves that could be felt miles away. Sentinel Prime staggered. For the first time since its awakening, it faltered. Massive gouges were torn into its armor, sections of its weapon arrays melting under the relentless bombardment. Its right arm, a colossal rail battery designed to shatter entire fleets, detonated under the strain. A gaping hole now smoldered where once there had been unstoppable firepower. But it did not fall. Instead, it roared. Not a sound in the traditional sense, but a signal. A wave of pure, unfiltered defiance that rippled through the battlefield, reaching every Valaran and human still standing. It was not done. Its systems rerouted power, drawing from deep core reserves untouched for centuries. Damage reports flooded its processors, but the machine ignored them. Instead, it did what it was made to do. It fought back. A massive burst of kinetic force erupted outward, sending the closest Torvok ship spiraling from the sheer impact. Its remaining weapon arrays locked onto the enemy fleet, and with calculated fury, it fired. One after another, Torvok vessels were torn apart. A dreadnought, easily a match for planetary defense stations, collapsed in on itself as Sentinel Prime's Graviton Lance punched through its hull, sending cascading black hole implosions through its structure. A carrier ship, deploying an entire wave of drones to swarm the battlefield, was incinerated in an instant, its swarming machines never even reaching the surface before being vaporized. And then, the Sentinel changed tactics. Even with its immense firepower, it wasn't enough to destroy the entire Torvok fleet. But the Sentinel understood something the enemy did not. This was no longer just a battle of weapons. It was a battle of morale. It broadcasted, using ancient Valaran frequency bands, long thought dead. It sent a signal into space. A message, not in words, but in images, data, cold, ruthless calculations of victory and loss, and the Torvok commanders saw it. They saw their fleet dwindling. They saw their strongest ships falling one by one, and they saw something worse. They saw fear, not from their enemies, from themselves. The realization spread like wildfire through the Torvok ranks. For the first time in their history, they had faced something they could not intimidate, could not outmaneuver. They had underestimated Valara. They had underestimated humanity, and now they were faced with a choice: fight to the last ship, or retreat. A moment of hesitation passed through their fleet. Carter saw it. Vasquez saw it. And so did Sentinel Prime. And then, the Torvok broke. First, it was a single ship disengaging, flickering into slipspace as it abandoned the fight. Then another. And another. Like a dying storm losing its strength, the once unstoppable armada crumbled, ships peeling away one after another. In minutes, the battlefield emptied. The Torvok were gone, and Valara still stood. Carter exhaled, his grip on the railing loosening. The Horizon's crew erupted into cheers, Velaran and human voices alike celebrating the impossible. But as Sentinel Prime lowered its weapons, its glowing eyes dimming slightly, a different feeling settled over Carter. This war was over. But something told him that this was only the beginning. The battlefield was silent now. But silence did not mean peace. It meant the end of a storm, the breath between battles, the uneasy calm before the weight of history settled upon those who had survived. Carter stood on the bridge of the Horizon, staring out at the remains of Valara's sky, still thick with the debris of war. What had once been a burning inferno of energy blasts and dying warships was now a graveyard of twisted metal, drifting in the void like tombstones of the fallen. The last Torvok ship had vanished into the darkness of space, its slipstream drive flaring one final time before disappearing from sensors, but no one dared to celebrate just yet. Because deep down, they all knew. This was not over. The Sentinel, their ancient and unlikely savior, remained motionless amid the ruins. Its towering frame, battle-scarred and still smoldering from the relentless assault, loomed over Valara's devastated surface like a titan from a forgotten age. Though its weapons were now silent, the raw power it had unleashed still resonated across the planet. Valaran forces were already moving through the wreckage below, searching for survivors, securing what remained of their cities, and reckoning with a truth they could no longer ignore. They had spent centuries fearing the past, burying it beneath layers of shame and denial. But now, the past had risen, not as a ghost, but as a weapon, forged in an age when Valara had ruled, not cowered. Carter turned to Vasquez, who had been monitoring the sensor reports. "Any sign of reinforcements?" he asked. She shook her head. If the Torvok had more ships on the way, they either turned back or decided this wasn't worth it anymore. He exhaled slowly. "Then we won." A hollow laugh escaped her lips. "Yeah, we won." But her expression didn't match her words. There was no joy in her eyes, only the weight of what winning had cost. The Torvok had been driven away, but at what price? Entire districts of Valara's capital lay in ruins. Thousands, maybe millions, had died in the assault. The Sentinel had turned the tide, but it had also exposed Valara's greatest secret. There was no erasing what had happened here. No pretending the Sentinel had not reawakened, and the rest of the galaxy would soon find out. The Valaran Council, battered but still standing, sent a direct request for Carter and his crew to meet with them. He knew what it was about before the message even finished transmitting. The fate of Valara, the fate of the Sentinel, and the fate of whatever came next. Inside the council chamber, the room was filled with the stench of smoke and desperation. Counselors sat at a long table, some still wearing battle-stained uniforms, others barely concealing the exhaustion in their eyes. The war had aged them all in a single day. High Counselor Dren spoke first, his voice steady despite the cracks. Forming beneath it, "We owe you our lives, Captain Carter." His gaze flickered toward Vasquez and the other human officers. "You and your people. Without you, Valara would have fallen." Carter nodded, waiting for the inevitable. "But we must speak of the Sentinel." There it was. He remained silent, letting Dren continue. "We never should have activated it," the counselor admitted. "We built our new society on the belief that the weapons of the past should remain buried. And yet, we would not be here if not for it." His fingers tightened into a fist against the table. "The galaxy will demand answers. The Torvok will not forget this. And we must decide what to do." Carter already knew what was coming. The Velarans had unleashed something they could not control, and now they feared it just as much as they had before. "Are you suggesting we shut it down?" Vasquez asked, the disbelief in her voice barely contained. "It was never meant to be used again," Dren insisted. "It was a relic of an empire that no longer exists. We must—" A new voice interrupted. Strong, unwavering. "No." All eyes turned to the source. General Kess, the same battle-hardened leader who had once opposed human intervention, now stood with his shoulders squared, his gaze unflinching. "You cannot bury this," he said, addressing the council as if daring them to argue. "You cannot erase what happened today. You cannot pretend Valara is the same world it was before." Dren hesitated, but Kess pressed on. "I fought in the trenches today. I saw our soldiers, our people, die because we were too afraid to prepare for war. I saw the Sentinel save this planet when nothing else could." He leaned forward, his voice a quiet storm. "And I will not watch you throw that away out of fear." Silence filled the chamber. Carter exchanged a glance with Vasquez. The tide was shifting, and they both knew it. Dren let out a slow breath. "Then what do you propose?" Kess turned to Carter. "I propose that we do what we should have done centuries ago." His eyes burned with something fierce, something long dormant in the Valaran people. "We stop running. We stop pretending we are not part of this galaxy. We stop hiding." The council murmured among themselves. Some nodded, others looked uncertain. Carter decided it was time to speak. "I know you fear what the galaxy will say when they learn what happened here. The Torvok will spread the news of what they faced. And soon the entire sector will know Valara is not a defenseless world anymore." He let that sink in. "But the question is, what will you do about it?" More silence. Then, slowly, the murmurs began turning into agreement. Valara had spent centuries pretending it was no longer a power in the galaxy. But that illusion had shattered, and the Sentinel? It remained, silent, waiting, a guardian that had once been abandoned. Now, standing in the ruins of the world it had been built to protect. Valara was no longer a world in exile. It had returned, and the galaxy would know its name once more.